Good morning and welcome to our second day's events for our conference on Mormonism and Islam. My name is Blair Van Dyke, and on behalf of Utah Valley University and the Religious Studies program, again I extend our heartiest welcome to you and count you our close colleagues and friends and most welcomed guests. Our opening session this morning, very much looking forward to the papers that will be presented and the rigorous discussion and questions that will no doubt follow. As you can see from your program, the title of this session is Interfaith Dialogue as a Religious Principle. And our two speakers in conjunction with this session are Najeeba Syeed-Miller and Randy Paul. And if I could just briefly introduce them, as you have detailed information in the conference program about them that you could refer to. But Dr. Miller is an assistant professor of interreligious education at Claremont Graduate School. She's received multiple bachelor's degrees and a Juris Doctorate. Most significantly for our purposes this morning, she is focused on faith-based diplomacy and deeply committed to the principles associated with interfaith dialogue and interreligious diplomacy. Our second speaker, Randall Paul, is the president of the Foundation for Interreligious Diplomacy. He holds a Master's of Business Administration from Harvard, worked in the real estate development industry for some time, entered again academia and received a PhD from the University of Chicago. His focus, as his foundation indicates, is on the principles of interreligious diplomacy. He executes and carries out diplomatic undertakings in a variety of locations nationally and internationally, and is very, very well known both in settings like this, universities, across the board as far as religious organizations, and is highly respected also for the writings that he has produced. And so, if you will join me in welcoming our speakers this morning, Dr. Syeed-Miller and Randall Paul. Thank you.
So we're discussing who goes first, the Mormon or the Muslim. I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to just thank Boyd Peterson and Dr. Birch for organizing this conference. I think it's long overdue, and this conversation is one that is important not just for us to have with one another as traditions, but also for our communities as well as our scholars to begin to understand what are the relationships between the LDS as well as the Muslim community, and what are the differences. I think we need to be very open as well about our differences. So I've been asked to speak about my philosophy for pedagogy in what we call interreligious education. Due to time, I will condense my remarks and provide you with at least the landscape of what we're doing at Claremont School of Theology as we create the first graduate seminary preparing Muslims, Jews, and Christians for leadership in their community. We are indeed co-creating a new field of study, research, and theological inquiry. We are treading a new path that traces its genealogy through comparative religious studies into a multidisciplinary track for educating both future theologians and clerical leaders. The very way we organize both knowledge and the institutions that serve educational purposes will be redefined. What is unique about this endeavor, the idea of interreligious education and dialogue, is that the halls of research and an institution need to be permeated with the notion of how we approach pluralism. While this is a forward-thinking approach, it is also important to remember that deep traditions of scholarship and practice of each partner must be honored. The process should be reinvigorating. These types of conferences should be reinvigorating for all religious traditions that are a part of these conversations at formative stages. It allows us to speak firmly grounded in our past, ready for the present, and poised to write together what the future of the world will be. Pluralistic, with a deep appreciation for the role of religion as a problem solver in the 21st century. We are here, and we must do this together. The place to start is to think of how our own traditions treat the other amongst us. While there are many considerations to be made for when the other is in the midst of another community, in the field of interreligious education, it is the experience of having the representation of another group within our own that is the deeper challenge. The path to God is littered with casualties for all religious groups, and the endeavor of establishing multi-religious conversations must create a space to answer that question. As we introduce a foreign object into our midst, are we ready to understand how we preserve our own faith traditions, and what will the culture that we co-create in conversation be like? What are the probing, self-reflective questions we must answer? The most potent examples for successful multi-confessional points in history do what I call re-mythologizing. They break into and reconstruct the narrative that each faith is destined to be at odds with one another. We, in fact, build a new set of characters, unearth stories of hidden, and bring to light perhaps what some have called often our knowledges that are underneath the undercurrent of our knowledge that is often at the surface. For it is in these spaces where coexistence was possible that the myth of separation and intentional alienation is shattered. It is in these stories that faith finds its place in our hearts, our minds, and scholarship as a unifying element of existence. After law school, I was invited to study at The Hague and to study with students from 60 countries in the area of conflict intervention. Let me locate myself. I work in the area of conflict intervention, have done work with Guam, trained people who are going to work in Afghanistan, Latin America, and I'm very interested in the formation of identity, especially in volatile conflicts and what we call areas where people have oppositional identities. Their identities are essentially created in opposition to someone else. So one thing that struck me when I was in The Hague, as I was meeting people, there were people from Rwanda that came up to me and they said, I was struck, usually as a Muslim, I'm clearly Muslim to most people, these Rwandans said, we love you, we love your people. And let me tell you, in this day and age, not many Muslims get that reaction. And I thought, what's going on here? What's the story that I don't know about Rwanda? What's the role of my community in that conflict? So let me explain to you what happened there. Ramadhani Rugema, executive director of the Muslim Association of Rwanda, in an article with the New York Times said, nobody died in a mosque. No Muslim wanted any other Muslim to die. We stood up to the militias and we helped many non-Muslims get away. As a result, over 500 mosques were present in Rwanda after the genocide in 2004, double than were there before the genocide. We must be investigators of the highest caliber, using forensic skills, not CSI forensic skills, you know what I'm talking about, using forensic research skills to extract historical examples, such as many of us know, the one that we think of very often, Spain, and many others, of when we were able to mix with one another. Remythologizing is absolutely necessary from a historical perspective, and at a more profound level, it calls upon us to engage in courageous theology, to unearth intrinsic reason in our own traditions to work across faiths. It can't just be that we engage in this work because it makes our own faith look good, or we do it because we like people. It has to be from within our own tradition that we have a reason, an intrinsic value that we bring to the table. We must answer the basic question, why should I or we learn about other faiths? What is the inherent religious value from my own text that behooves me to do so? We have been doing so within the Muslim tradition for several decades, and we see the impact both in the scholarly and lay community of work that has been done by many to find an indigenous reasoning and rationale for engaging the other. We are moving beyond the notion of tolerance and acceptance into the mode of embracing the other while holding tightly on to our own traditions. It's very important that I want to emphasize this because often in multi-faith engagement, there is a push to a unanimity of theology or understanding of history or opinion. And it's very helpful to understand that in these conversations, this is not a space that needs to compromise one's own identity. It is, in fact, by having the literacy and the commitment to our own traditions that strengthens the conversations. One of the things that has emerged in the area of jurisprudence, I wasn't sure how detailed to go with you, but we've been working in this internally in our community in the development of fiqh al-aqalliyat, which is the jurisprudence of Muslim minorities. It's emerging as one of the most significant developments in modern Islamic thought. How are minority Muslim communities living when they are diverse from a Muslim majority state? What does this do to the essential practice and theology of those that are within minority settings? Muslims living in a minority setting is not new. It finds its history in many communities, whether it be in India. Professors have talked about, for instance, Peter Hardy talked about the Indian experience as a remarkable form of cultural syncretism. And you see that there were many spaces in which Muslims were in the minority. So talking about what does that mean, how do we articulate, especially for those of you that are familiar with Islamic jurisprudence, we have various levels of sources of knowledge. And one of them is the notion of urf, or custom. And custom, in fact, there are very specific requirements in how we interpret the role of custom. But custom has always been part of how we approach interpretation of our texts. And as we move into a minority setting, the role of custom, or the culture that surrounds us, becomes even more important. How do we, for instance, profess allegiance to a state? And it's interesting for me, I grew up in the United States, and the idea of having any inherent conflict, both as a religious person and as a citizen of the United States, between my religion and my allegiance to the state, it never existed. For me, they were very much along the Muslim teachings of the notion of, for instance, to have allegiance to your state and to take the oath of allegiance is very important. And so that became a primary source of my identity. So we can speak about that a little bit more if you have questions. Modern scholars such as Khalid Abu Fadl have posited that classical Islamic scholars viewed contemporary forms of violence, such as acts of terrorism, as in contradiction to teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. Abu al-Fadl argues that unlike current radical theologians who declare unanimity of opinion on the affirmative duty to fight against non-Muslims, classical jurists had a much more nuanced approach to engaging the other. Many even argued for the notion of 10-year treaties for non-aggression, and as Muslims grew into international prominence, removed such limits and opened up the possibility for an indefinite duration in non-aggression to those that were not within the Muslim faith. I won't dwell on this topic, but I wanted to use it merely as an illustration, as the tool of remythologizing, both for historical inquiry and uncovering the theological responses to how communities responded to one another. We must have the courage to do so and not limit ourselves to interpretations that are often promulgated by those who possess an intentionally shallow knowledge and limited agenda for engagement of their own tradition vis-a-vis engaging those from other traditions. If one reviews the literature and speeches of many modern writers who are deemed to be scholars, some of them, they often speak of a return to the simplicity of the time of Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, as exemplified by many modern movements, a yearning to the bare-bones lifestyle and system of community governments as they see it. What these leaders have conflated is the austerity of the lifestyle with simplistic theology. They see the trapping of Prophet Muhammad's almost aesthetic existence and extrapolate that this must mean the principles of interpretation of text are also simple. However, it is clear that at the Prophet's time, the relationship with text was on a daily occurrence. The revelation of the Quran, the holy book of Muslims, came verse by verse over 23 years of prophethood. He himself made it clear that some of the verses, the way that we interpret them, have a very nuanced approach. Some of them were am, which means they were applied to the general population. Some of them were khas, they were specialized to a specific situation. We look at the asbab an-nuzul, the reasons for revelation, and to understand that the complexity and nuance was present even in the infancy of Islam, and difference of opinion was a daily factor. In fact, scholars, when they look at the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, they look at whether he was operating as an individual, they look at whether he was operating as someone who was presenting a religious teaching. So we have a nuanced way of even approaching his example. Was it a personal preference? Did he like a certain food? Was that something that Muslims will emulate, or is that merely a personal preference that we had? So scholars engage in this inquiry in his example. This leads me to my second point. When we develop the theology of engaging the other, the tendency to simplify and devolve into binary principles is understandable. For in experiencing the other, we want to draw the boundaries of our faith and the boundaries of the other. In the enterprise of establishing multi-faith conversations, we must wrangle with the tendency to produce exclusion based on a psychology of fear. So it is important that we have separate identities. However, if we begin to approach our conversation solely based on fear, then it leads us to a very difficult point with one another. This leads me to the third point is not often the substance of argument for inclusion, and that is which is the most difficult. It is how we prosecute such an endeavor, and the rules of engagement are perhaps the most important to consider. I am reminded of the great Jewish scholar Rashi, who says justice must be achieved by just means. In my own work and writing, I allude to the use of dialogue in the design of dialogue. When we are convening multi-faith conversations, the power of the convener is extremely important, as we know from conflict resolution theory. A convener is it's defined as someone who brings parties together in a positive and productive frame of mind. And if someone other than the convener takes over the process, it is important to understand that the stakeholders play an integral role in choosing the new convener. This comes from the work of Susskind and Cruikshank. The convener sets the tone for the new paradigm of engagement. You all seated here carry a great honor and burden in how you will frame the relationship with the other. As an instructor, I take this power as a convener very seriously and develop rules of engagement within the setting of the classroom that create safe spaces for confidential conversation, open dialogue, and questioning of the professor, critique of processes introduced by the professors so that students are essentially in dialogue about dialogue. Utilizing an elicitive approach is absolutely central to interreligious instruction. While we used to value basic information as the goal for comparative theology, we need now to place a premium on the skills of engagement and develop those skills within the academy. Religious scholars and leaders are facing increasing distrust in faith-based institutions. institutions. When I speak to young people, you know, the number one reason that when I speak to young Muslims or young Christians that are leaving their faith-based institutions, it's not about a disagreement with theology. They think that the leadership cannot produce a methodology of getting along with one another in a way that's better than what they see out there in the world. So I've mediated many conflicts between religious leaders within communities and across communities. So there is a need for vocational leaders and theologians to understand the mechanics of trust and how to perform reconciliation, if necessary, between traditions that have often been at odds with one another. We are moving from rules of engagement in interreligious conversations that often pitted one scholar against the other. I'm reminded that one of the hot debates in medieval times between Muslim and Jewish scholars was which child of Abraham was being sacrificed, Isaac or Ishmael on the mount. So those were the types of conversations we may have had previously. Are we going to continue to iterate those or reiterate those types of engagements? We also had many generative conversations as well. I'm only going to go over 3 or 4 points around engagement that I suggest, and I have much more to share with you, but I have my colleague who I'm interested to hear from, as I mentioned, around dialogue. At this point in history, it's important to explore some basic rules of engagement. One of the things that's very important is to promote the recognition of interdependence. Coexistence theory, which grew out of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Cold War in Northern Ireland, where communities have what we call oppositional identities. I mentioned this earlier. Interdependence does not often start with theological interpretation. It may start with pragmatic approaches, such as a joint nursery school in a conflict zone, and then a sequential building up to more in-depth discussion and probing into joint religious traditions. Sequencing is extremely important in the development of the recognition of interdependence. One cannot start with this as the basis for instruction if there is a perceptual block or denial of interdependence. So what's very important is that we need to think about how to build intergroup conversations. Allport and Pettigrew say that if we engage with one another, ultimately this can lead to what we call deprovincialization, by which Pettigrew means that we see the world more and more, we have the ability to see the world more and more from the outgroup perspective than from our own. So we're able to actually see the world from someone else's perspective if we engage with one another. Another point that we need to think about is responding to varying definitions of justice. Each faith-based community has a historical perspective on the views of the crimes against each other. The role of including these narratives is the key to creating productive educational experiences. Justice is a theme that resonates with most communities. For example, from an Islamic perspective, there are the view of the rights of men or women with one another and the rights of God. We see justice in a very rich way. Any interreligious experience must be inclusive of a discussion and exploration of justice, both from each tradition and across traditions through an exploration of reconciliation if necessary. So these are some of the things that I wanted to keep in mind. Many interfaith reconciliation venues have sprung up around the country, with a particular focus on what we call Abrahamic reconciliation. I was a participant recently in a process developed by Brian Cox of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy that was convened by Christians and had participants from all 3 traditions. I wanted to point out something very specific about the role of Christians, or those from the Christian community in interfaith dialogue. It was interesting to me because the dialogue in that situation was between Muslims and Jews, but it was the Christian community that actually convened us. And I was fascinated to hear recently there was a dialogue established between Shias and Sunnis, and each of the one of the sectarian Muslim groups asked for a Christian mediator to be present so that they had an outsider who would help build trust. So think about your unique role, not just in resolving conflicts between you and the other, but between communities that may see you as a bridge. Perhaps we'll see Muslims as a bridge in other scenarios, or Mormons as a specific bridge, I don't know. But depending on your particular history and social location, you may have a trust that you haven't even thought about, or a community that trusts you that you don't even know about, or you haven't yet acknowledged. Essentially, the role of justice-based approaches is to build trust. When trust has been violated, the environment needs to be calibrated to the level of the offense. Lewicki and Tomlinson define this as offense violation, which is determined by the severity of the offense, the number of the prior offenses. Lewicki and Tomlinson point to perspective-taking skills as the key to rebuilding any process. Essentially, people must be attuned to the reaction that others have to their actions and perceive how to remedy such behavior, whether through apology, reconciliation, and what is unique to interfaith conversations is the notion of sacrifice. If I'm doing intergroup dialogue, the notion of sacrifice is very difficult to talk about. But from the unique experience of Muslims as well as other faith groups, the idea of some level of sacrifice is what can elevate a conflict. When teaching interreligious studies and dialogue, we must emphasize these perspective-taking skills that allow leaders and future scholars to build empathy for others while firmly grounded in their own tradition. Walking a mile in someone else's shoes is something we must build into the experiential mode of engaging with others. So I wanted to end with one more point, and then I have a piece around best practices in the field, but I wanted to end with just one last point. Access to power while promoting new definitions of power relationships and shifting unhealthy dynamics in existing relationships is very important when we engage across faiths. Those opposed to reconciliation or engagement across faiths cite the intractability of certain conflicts or community as inherent in their incapacity to work with one another. This is by far the most virulent threat to cross-religious encounters. The fiction of unrelatability finds its greatest comfort in the notion of a clash of either religions or communities. At the very least, we know that by speaking something to be truth, if it is repeated enough, it will be viewed as truth. Scholars such as Hans Kochler and Gruten Gabher in their edited volume, Civilizations, Conflict or Dialogue, ? They discuss the importance of what they call civilizational dialogue. Both of them recognize that the building block of this landscape of vast proportions is still the individual and his or her journey of encountering the other. And this is very much something that we need to keep in mind as we're having a conversation at the civilizational level. Essentially, the building block is the individual. The hermeneutic principles of civilizational dialogue are in fact internally derived while externally experienced. Kochler introduces the concept of the framework of the civilization as corrective of one's own instead of adversarial. So essentially, we learn more about ourselves when we are able to engage with one another. Kochler says that it's a sign of a mature civilization that can engage with the other. So I don't know if you want to consider yourself more mature, that's a great way to think about the notion of civilizational dialogue. So essentially, he talks about being ready to be open in a space of openness while maintaining a respect for the other and distinct values while maintaining your distinct cultural values and system. So I think it's helpful to begin to think about what are our intrinsic approaches to pluralism in our own communities, and what is the benefit of engaging in dialogue and cross-religious experiences with one another. And I tried to present some of the problems and also the challenges, and I'm happy to answer more specific questions. Thank you for your time.
I'm jumping up and down inside after hearing that speech. Thank you very much, Professor Syeed-Miller. That was a very important paper for me to hear, and I hope you'll make that a published document for us.
I do need to get tenure, so that's not, it's not something I want to do, it's something I'll
Today you professed to me, anyhow. In the Babylonian cosmogony, Enuma Elish, the gods create mankind to be their servants. But the noise that comes up from all the human voices on the earth bothers the gods and generates a violent war in heaven. It is all right to celebrate the diverse voices of humanity, but if you had to listen to them all the time like God's, you might lose your patience too. We have in our time the godlike ability to hear more voices at the same time than ever before on earth. Plurality of religions and cultural influences is not a new thing, but the common immediate awareness of contested pluralistic influences in our societies is the modern condition that we call pluralism. Yesterday, we heard speeches from different voices in an attempt to learn. We should have come away thinking, as scholars, that we have just begun to grasp the religious and culture of Islam or of Mormonism. To be educated is to be daunted by our ignorance. Like Pascal says, man is despicable, but man is magnificent because he knows he is despicable. In Socratic terms, that translates, we are, as scholars, are ignorant, but we are wise because we know we are ignorant. Yet there was a moment yesterday that was so beautiful for all of us that I must acknowledge it, even in our ignorance. When the LDS Institute Choir sang for us at dinner, the harmony of their voices, the harmony of their faces, moved us all to feel gratitude for each other as human beings, to love having eyes and ears and hearts and minds that can experience such love and beauty together. In contrast, and the word is vital to my point today, contrast, to the Mesopotamian story of noise, we have the phrase describing the biblical God's desire for mankind in Psalm 98, quote, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all the earth. Make a loud noise, and rejoice, and sing praise. For the Lord cometh to judge the world, and the people with equity." I think my theme today might be religious pluralism, painful cacophony, perfect harmony, or joyful noise, the third alternative. Last night, if someone had come from the kitchen offering us a fruity dessert that might, by magic, have benignly frozen each of us for a year to continually experience the beauty of the harmonic oneness we all felt together, would we have eaten the dessert? Do we desire to live in beautiful harmonic unity constantly and forever? This is a deeply religious question that I will leave on the table for all of us to think about today. I would like to begin this little speech, get my time right, by asking this question. My topic is how we treat our opponents reveals our true religion, and I'd like to begin with this question for the Abrahamic traditions. How does God treat Satan in your tradition? In Judaism, in Genesis 3 and in Job, first chapter, I'll do some quick riffs here. I'll bring the third tradition in, even though they're not formally present today. God, as Milton said, hold it, I've got the right, I have to get my Judas. God, as Milton said, left Eden ill-fenced, and the serpent that most interpreters take to be the devil in animal form tempted Eve to take the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil to become as the gods. When the Lord addressed the serpent, he curses it to crawl on the ground and be susceptible to the violence of men, and vice versa. God seems to charge Adam and Eve with more punishment, however, than with the serpent who instigated it. One supposes, for a while at least, he leaves Adam and Eve alone, the serpent that is, and that God then has to deal with the real issue at hand, which is Adam and Eve's living in the world. God did not act at that moment to eliminate the serpent or to turn it into a bunny rabbit. The tone is calm and resigned in God's words in in Genesis to the serpent. Further, in that text, there is no response from the serpent. In an unusual account of a chilling conversation between God and Satan in Job, the latter is charged with the freedom to harm everything that matters to Job, everything except his own survival. This is a test of Job's loyalty to God. And indirectly, if you look at what matters most, the subtext of Job is the loyalty to God was being tested in this text. Though that wasn't explicit in the test that Satan put forth. This is a test of Job's loyalty to God, and it leaves him with no family, no real friends, no wealth, no health, and no answers for why God has allowed this to happen. Satan responds with a proposition to God, of course, in this whole setup, who has bragged to Satan about Job's fidelity, and to the other sons of God in that text, about how there is none quite like Job. Satan takes that challenge. His virtue, he says, in Miltonian terms, is too cloistered. To be certain, says the devil, let's put him to a real test. This conversation occurs in heaven. And it suggests that God and the devil are on speaking terms. This is a remarkable text in and of itself. Now let's move to Christianity. Matthew 4 and Luke 4. In the desert, after a 40-day fast, Jesus met Satan, the devil, who tempted him by taking him to see things that would intensify his desire for comfort, power, and glory. These boons he was promised if he would give allegiance to Satan. Remarkably, Jesus submitted to these temptations, being led around by the devil and engaging in conversation with the devil. And for those, this is interreligious dialogue, Jesus equals God to the Christians. God being led around by the devil. Now, there's a Trinitarian gloss there, but it's still, you do the math, do the algebra. Remarkably, Jesus submitted these temptations. After their exchange, Jesus stood pat, telling Satan to leave him alone, and quoting the first great commandment, "Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." Satan left without another word. In this dialogue, there was no anger or refusal to respond, just firm resolve. Let's move to Islam. In Al-Hijra, did I say that right? 15, 25 through 48, and in the Heights, 7, 10 through 18, the following stories occurred. And the angels prostrated themselves before Adam, all except Satan, who refused. "Satan," said God, "why do you not prostrate yourself?" He replied, "I will not bow to a mortal created of clay and black molten loam. I am nobler than Adam. You created me of fire and him of clay." "Begone," said God. "You are accursed. Away with you. This is no place for your contemptuous pride. Henceforth you shall be humble. A despicable outcast you shall be. My curse shall be upon you till the judgment day." "Lord," said Satan, "reprieve me till the day of resurrection." God answered, "You are reprieved till the appointed day." "Lord," said Satan, since you have led me astray, I will lead mankind astray on earth. I will seduce them all, except those that faithfully serve you." God replied, "This is the right course for me. You shall have no power over my servants, except the sinners who follow, and with them I shall fill the pit of hell. But the righteous shall dwell among the gardens in peace, and we shall remove any sense of injury from their hearts, and they shall recline on couches as brothers face to face." Since this is a a Mormon Christian tradition dialogue with Islam today, I'm going to take the liberty of adding a Mormon set of texts of dialogue between God and Satan to this mix that we're looking at here. In the Mormon scripture called the Book of Moses, given as a special revelation to the mind of Prophet Joseph Smith, peace be upon him, in 1830, Moses is transfigured to withstand a face-to-face visit from God, who shows him the history and purpose of the world. Then, after God leaves, Satan comes to tell Moses he should worship Satan as the real God of the world. Moses responds, "Who art thou? For behold, I am a son of God, in the similitude of the only begotten. And where is thy glory, that I should worship you, Satan? I could not look upon God, except his glory should come upon me, and I was transfigured before him. But I can look upon thee in the natural man. Is it not true, surely? I can judge between thee and God. Get thee hence, Satan, and deceive me not." The text of the Book of Moses and another text called the Book of Abraham, another revelatory work to Joseph Smith, according to a renowned Mormon scholar, Hugh Nibley, provides the written foundation for the Mormon oral creation and ascent stories that are the rituals celebrated in the Mormon temples. Strikingly like the passages in the Quran, the oral creation story of the Mormons describes a direct encounter between God the Father, Jesus, and Satan, in which Satan angrily accuses God of being unjust for punishing him for helping him out, for helping Adam and Eve gain the knowledge of good and evil and become like the gods. Satan says he will bring violence to the earth to thwart and harm mankind and the purposes of God, to get back at God for this unjust punishment. And God simply says to Satan, "Depart." And Satan does. These sets of texts I leave for you to think about with respect to the alternatives. What is amazing in all these stories is this fact: the evil elephant is left standing in the room, or at least the universe, by a supposedly just and loving God. God does not annihilate Satan, nor instruct his servants to do so. He says, "Be gone." He doesn't say, "Poof, be annihilated." The description of a violent pre-creation war in heaven between Satan and God is not clearly drawn in the Bible, but Milton took the apocryphal sources available to him and poetic imagination to present a military engagement of heavenly forces in Paradise Lost. Unlike the Mesopotamian and early Greek sacred stories of violent relationships between evil and good gods, the Abrahamic classic record shows God and the devil relating on stern but diplomatic terms. If on earth it should be as it is in heaven, as some of us pray, then measured conflict should be considered a normal part of the divine economy, there and here. In Yemen a few years ago, I spent a couple of days interviewing the head jurist in the country, Hamoud al-Hittar, well known for his rehabilitation plan that engaged Islamic missionaries to meet with about 275 young men who were in jail for being al-Qaeda sympathizers at the time of the bombing of the USS Cole. During our discussion, I asked al-Hittar if he could have an honest dialogue with an atheist. Forget these people of the book. Even forget other believers. I mean a real atheist. And he quickly responded. In the Quran, God has a discussion with Iblis. If God can have a frank talk with the devil, I can certainly have a dialogue with a non-believer. I love Al-Hattar. He's one of my favorites. This next section I call it, Fight We Must, but How is Up to Us. The New Testament, Matthew 10 and Luke 12, records that, by the way, I might move into a Mormon Christian mode of speech. I'm so used to trying to distance myself in interreligious affairs to being this mediating force, this bridge. But today I've got my Mormon hat on, and I'm also talking about interreligious stuff, so you'll nuance my words, please, today, appropriately. The New Testament, Matthew 10 and 12, records that Jesus said, quote, "Suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth? I tell you, nay, but rather division. Even a household shall be divided, and father shall be against the son, and mother against the daughter." But Jesus also said in Matthew 5 that whoso is angry with his brother, or even calls him a fool, is in danger of hellfire, adding that when offenses occur, before making any prayer offerings or doing any ritual holiness to God, we should first try to reconcile with those in who we find ourselves in an offensive relationship. And then the scripture adds, in another place, Jesus says, "Agree with your adversary quickly while on the way with him to the court, to avoid escalating your dispute to an extreme that will bring even greater judgment upon you." What does this mean for those in disagreements about the truth of God and the purpose of life and these things that really matter most? Does it mean we should have no such disagreements? Jesus himself came to force us into a decision about religion that is divisive among families and nations. So what do we agree quickly about with our adversaries or our enemies? How do we agree quickly when the question is the divinity of Jesus versus him being a Messiah or prophet, or the finality of prophetic revelation in the seal of the prophets, Muhammad, or in this continuing prophetic revelation and open texts of the Mormons? These are not subjects I think we can agree quickly about. The answer is we agree quickly that we will communicate, that we care about each other sincerely, and that we will not speak in anger together or call each other fools. Divided on doctrinal belief and religious practice, we must be, when integrity requires, divided. But we are to agree that we will engage our differences honorably, doing what we can to listen to our adversaries sincerely, letting them know we honor them as honest opponents. Offenses, Jesus says, will come when truth is the matter of the contest. But we need not take offense when we engage over the truth. That is a personal and psychological decision, as Kierkegaard made very clear in his work. In Judaism, in Islam, and in Christianity, traditional and Mormon-style Christianity, we are enjoined to cooperate in the method for engaging in conflict. That method is listening carefully, face to face, and responding honestly without angry accusations or threats. We have three ways of responding in religious conversations. One, rational, logical debate, using religious and historical texts usually as the basis. Two, personal witnessing of our religious experiences, using our life stories as the basis for that exchange. And three, mutual honoring and loving nonverbal interactive presence, mainly shown as eye contact when listening. That is a incredible fundamental basis. The reason in the ancient world you did not go to eat with somebody face to face was twofold. One, it showed that you were both human. You digested the same food. You therefore probably procreated and could intermarry, and your children could see that, you were not different species. But at the social and psychological level, there was also the eye-to-eye contact of influence, the contamination of souls that made that person, from that point forward, a part of you and you a part of them. If you will, the intercourse was at the appetizer. You sit down together and the intercourse begins. You infect, you contaminate, you cross-fertilize each other. This is the most profound aspect of any interreligious dialogue, this third point. I am standing here, I am using your name, I am listening to you, I am giving you the gift of influencing me in silence right now. That is the incredible big message. And that's why conferences like this do not work very well on interreligious dialogue, whereas you get together with somebody in the back chairs during when nothing else is really going on. That's what's really going on, eyeball to eyeball contact, sitting in the back chairs with somebody. Okay. But fear not, we have now new technologies in the world that allow us to try to mimic the one-on-one so that we can all get a feeling for it massively. That's what my foundation's all about. So that was a sales pitch. Watch for the World Table of Religion on the internet coming forth in the next year. You'll see what we're talking about there. But back to the do I have time? Okay, I've got to get to the bottom. I do not have time. Well, that was appropriate. I do not have time to go into detail here on the subject, but most of you who have had inter and intra-religious dialogue, deep conversation that reflects these three aspects of method for cooperating and remaining in conflict will understand what I'm saying here. As a pragmatist, I believe it is very useful for people to believe that God will judge our hearts and deeds in the long run, not based on whether we had the correct understanding of God, but whether we tried lovingly to listen to each other as we honestly tried to persuade each other of our partial understandings of God. That kind of is my thesis statement. And when we engage this way, we will usually come to a point of understanding of our differences that is impossible to harmonize or minimize. The French say, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. We often think that means if we just understand each other, we can see there is no real offense, no need to hold grudges between us. We just misunderstood each other. But when religious differences are seen as a matter of eternal life and death, or that like, the phrase of the French takes a very different cast. The understanding shines stark light on our outrageously different beliefs about God and our destinies and what it takes to get into heaven, and makes clear the need for forgiveness of our offensive theologies, our offensive practices, as they stand and as we stand unrepentant before each other. To understand somebody in interreligious dialogue, at one level, you grasp why you should be in conflict. I had an experience years ago with a Jewish friend in dialogue where he finally grasped what I told him Joseph Smith's vision was. And the bridge builder in that case happened to be a Muslim who also got it at this point and saw how wildly crazy Mormon theology is. I had already told him the Joseph Smith story, and my Jewish colleague had known me for 2 years. I finally went back, and we were in the dialogue. I was giving an example, and I said, and of course this was God, Almighty God was there, and Jesus Christ was there, and they told Joseph Smith, and he put his hand up and said, well, what did you just say? Almighty God and Jesus Christ. But you said there were two two bodies. You said there was, or, what? He became totally speechless. He finally got that Mormons really believe that God, Almighty God, at least, this is for you theologians out there, at least has a body. Okay? And he, at that time, his friendly face blanched. He leaned back and said, literally, "That's blasphemy." And I realized at that moment, we are now in dialogue. And you laugh there because you're uncomfortable about that truth. It's the aporia, the uncomfortable, unharmonizable, irreconcilable, irresolvable truth differences that we have in our hearts and in our minds as religious people and as non-religious people. There are ideologues who hold their ideologies just as strongly as some people hold religious faith. And so what has been the liberal policy, and I'm going to end right now, has been to avoid that conflict. Let's just agree that we need to feed the poor and be nice to each other. And that's what really matters. What we don't realize, among a lot of people who have that attitude, that most religious people who believe in an afterlife say, you know what, it really doesn't matter whether I'm poor or whether I die of scurvy. What matters is eternity. And so if someone is going to be nice to me and feed me and do all that kind of thing and seduce me to think that his religion is just as true as mine, and I start diluting my beliefs and practices in his or her direction and don't teach my children the firm truth that's going to get them to heaven forever, then am I doing anybody a service by making sure they have a higher standard of living for a few hours on this planet and fry forever in hell? And it's that kind of thinking we've got to realize is very much part of the interreligious reality we're in. And not be afraid of it. Not be afraid of it, but enjoy each other's real belief that this makes a difference and find ways of engaging it. So I'm going to shut up now, but just say let's keep this discussion going. You can see where I'm going to take this. I wrote much too much today. Thank you for listening to me as long as you did.
Dr. Syeed-Miller and Dr. Paul, thank you very much. They will be back on a panel discussion where you will be able to ask a variety of questions at your discretion following the keynote. Why don't you stand where you're at? I wouldn't move. Lots of people coming in. We'll set up a handful of more chairs, and then I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Steve Prothero. Before I do that, before you do stand up, though, let me explain. We acknowledge respectfully that this is a holy day in Islam, and that it is a particularly sacred day for prayer, as is every day. If you have a desire to carry out your midday prayers, and you are wondering if there is a place set apart for that, the Institute of Religion, the Mormon Institute of Religion, adjacent to the campus here at Utah Valley University, it's only about 60 feet away. The university's grown into that building, has set apart a room for that purpose. And so you'd simply need to contact me, Blair Van Dyke, or Brian Birch, and we could facilitate that need for you and escort you to that room, which is adjacent to a washroom. And I think you could carry out your Friday prayers with great devotion. All right? Why don't you stand just for a moment? We'll set up a handful of chairs and stretch your legs, and we'll look forward to introducing Steve Prothero.